Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Child Anxiety FAQ podcast. FAQ stands for Frequently Asked Questions, and I'm answering listener questions about child and teen anxiety. My name is Dawn Friedman, and I have been working with kids and families for more than 30 years as a preschool teacher, parent educator, family case manager, clinical counselor, and now as the owner and operator of Child Anxiety Support, where I help parents of anxious kids. This episode's question is, in the podcast, you mentioned crying as a form of coping. How can I differentiate between healthy coping crying and when my child might be overwhelmed or in distress? Excellent question. It can be confusing. As I said in an earlier podcast, which I will make sure to link in the show notes, crying can be a form of coping. Lots of us cry when we're feeling overwhelmed on our way to doing the thing. I know I can cry when I get angry or frustrated. People can cry when they're hurting, people can cry when they're grieving, and people, of course, can cry when they're scared. So, how do we know when crying is an indicator that a child is overwhelmed and when it is a sign that the child is moving towards the thing? Let's back up and remind ourselves that dysfunctional anxiety is all about avoidance. When kids' anxiety gets in the way of their functioning or the family's functioning, that is when we need to address and start intervening. We need to address the anxiety. We need to start creating appropriate exposures. Let's think about a child who is working on an exposure. Let's talk about bedtime, since that's very common. Let's say we have a child. I think we've used the name Joan before. Let's use Joan again. And let's say that Joan is 8 years old and her parents lie down with her at night until she falls asleep. And the family is working on Joan falling asleep by herself. And the family's trying to figure out whether or not they should push through Joan's obvious discomfort at being left alone. Now, the family sits down and they come up with a plan. And the parents say to Joan, "Hey, we have realized that laying down with you at night isn't really helping you overcome your anxiety about sleeping alone. And we believe that you are fully capable of falling asleep by yourself. And we understand you don't like it, but we have decided to stop laying down with you so you can practice being alone at night. You are ready to do this," whatever language they want to use. And then they let Joan know, "We are going to leave you alone at night." And perhaps they're just going to do it for a few minutes. So they're not going to say, "We're going to go from laying down with you at night to not laying down with you at all." Probably not going to do that. And it might be that they say, "We are going to read 2 books, and then we were going to give hugs, and then I'm going to set a timer and I'm going to lay down with you for 10 minutes and then I'm going to leave." Or maybe it's the opposite. "We're going to read 2 books. I'm going to give you hugs. I'm going to leave the room for 10 minutes and then I will come back to you." And it depends on the family's goals, the big picture around Joan, whatever. But basically, they're pulling back on it, right? Now, when they're pulling back, Joan may not like it and she may begin to cry. This can be very triggering for parents because we can project a whole lot on it. Like, "Oh my gosh, she feels abandoned. Oh my gosh, she feels like we don't love her." And Joan might even say that. "You don't even love me. You don't even care." And this is why we put some time limits around it. We are talking about going towards the ultimate goal of Joan sleeping by herself, and we are doing it in a way that is manageable for Joan and for ourselves. As we learn, what does it look like when Joan is left alone? What does it look like if Joan needs to cry a little bit? Now, Joan is 8. She has object permanence. This is not like leaving a 6-month-old infant to cry. This is not like leaving a tiny baby to cry who has no idea that when the parents leave the room, they still exist. Joan knows you still exist. Joan knows you're still in the house. And you have informed Joan that you're doing this in a totally non-judgmental way. You haven't said, "You should be a big girl and you should do this alone." You have said, We have realized that laying down with you has sent a message that you need our help. And actually, I don't think you need our help anymore. And that's our bad. That's our mistake of sending you this message. And actually, I think we're getting in the way of you really coming into your brave, strong self. And so this is our plan. How do we know, though, if Joan is overwhelmed? What if we've decided, I'm going to read 2 books, we're going to give you hugs goodnight, and then I am not coming in again, which might be appropriate for some kids. It might be that big step for some kids. It depends on the kid. It depends on where the family's at, all of those things. Let's say the family does that and Joan really, really, really flips out. Is this coping or is this true distress? Again, it depends on Joan. I would say you know your child best. I want you to look at past meltdowns, past times your child has become overwhelmed. What does that look like? When do you know they have passed the point of no return? Some kids go 0 to 60 really quickly. Some intense kids, there is no warm up. For other kids, though, it might start with a little bit of whining. Maybe their tears look different, like maybe they're silent tears versus screaming tears. What is your indicator when your child has tipped over? If you don't know, you can start slower at night and be super observant. I know that people really wish that I had a one size fits all answer. There is no such thing as one size fits all parenting. There's not. You're a different human than every other human. Your child is a different human than every other human. Your circumstances are unique. Your capacity is different. Your expectations and goals and values, those are all different. And those all come into play when we're making decisions about an anxiety intervention plan. So, what I would want to know from you is how do you know for certain your child is in distress? Not you're not sure, you're kind of thinking, you're sort of projecting, but how do you know when your child has crossed the line? I have 2 very different kids, and their distress looks very different. There's one who cries really easily. That child's crying, she's an adult now, but her crying was different than her brother's because he did not cry as easily. So tears meant something different for him than for her. My daughter tends to be more expressive in her emotions. She is more apt to share her feelings. Her brother is more private. His distress does not have the same outward expression as hers, even when they were tiny children. This is true for your child too. So if I said crying always means this, I would be erasing the experience of some families. So I am not going to say that. I'm going to ask you to tune in to your wisdom about it. Now, what if you make a mistake? What if you get it wrong? Are you going to damage your child forever if you get it wrong? And the answer is no, no. Not if we continue to be observant and we continue to course correct. Not if you continue to thoughtfully be present for what's happening and slow down enough to observe and think about your response. Sometimes the preparation around dealing with child anxiety needs to be pretty long because you're going to be doing some observation. You're going to create a plan based on observation. You're going to observe the plan. You're going to interrogate your observations and, if necessary, course correct. This step-by-step kind of instructions sounds much more difficult than it is. It's kinda like when you're making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you do it without thinking. You know which knife to grab. You know how to open a peanut butter jar. You don't need to explain every single step. You've got some muscle memory. This is true in your work with your child too. You just may not realize it, and you may need to tune in a little bit to what you're already doing so that you can make these informed decisions. Sometimes it is very helpful to have an outsider helping you to ask those questions, to notice things. And this is really where the work that I do comes in. What I'm doing is slowing parents down and asking them questions and reflecting back on what I'm observing and hearing from them to help them tune into what they already know but didn't know they knew, and to help their child begin to be present in that too, ultimately. This is not something a 5-year-old might be capable of doing, although it depends on the 5-year-old. But we are trying to raise kids who can be aware and mindful and present for their own experience so they can make decisions moving forward as they continue to grow and learn how to manage their anxious brains. Does this make sense? So, how can you differentiate between healthy coping crying and when your child is overwhelmed? Really depends on your child, but it takes careful observation. It takes some experimenting. It takes some course correction. If you have a question you would like to ask me on the show, you can go to my website, childanxietysupport.com, go to the podcast tab in the menu, and it'll come up with a form to ask me your question. And also, that's where you can learn about how to work with me if you would like help in creating an effective, personalized program for your anxious child.